Welcome everybody to Baha'i.chat. I'm so happy everyone is here today. What Baha'i.chat is a conversation series dedicated to our interconnectedness. It's an uplifting moment when we can turn our thoughts to spiritual ideas. Each weekly session is rooted in the Baha'i Writings and the fundamental teachings of the oneness of God, religion, and humanity, led by individuals who are putting these principles into action. We are live streaming today's conversation on Facebook. You can find the link for that live stream in the chat box on the bottom of your Zoom view. You can share today's live stream program right now by clicking on the link provided, which will take you to our Facebook page, where you can simply select share. Baha'is believe that we are living in the great day of God foretold by each of his previous messengers who have established the major world religions. All of these divine educators are connected. Their message is progressive, always leading mankind forward to new levels of unity. Each has been the bearer of a preordained message essential for the times. God's latest manifestation, the founder of the Baha'i faith, is Baha'u'llah, an Arabic title meaning the glory of God. He appeared in Iran in the middle of the 19th century, bringing an unprecedented volume of teachings with the overarching and essential mission of the unification of the entire human race, a reality promised in the scriptures associated with each of God's former prophets. There's no doubt that we are living in very trying times, times of growing friction and disunity, times also foretold by God's former messengers, times that would precede the ultimate gathering together of mankind. The old systems of the world now, perhaps more than ever, appear to be unraveling before our very eyes. Time-honored institutions are crumbling, evidently incapable of providing relief to billions who are suffering in every corner of the world. Referring to each of the messengers of God as having been the source of God's healing remedy through the ages, Baha'u'llah wrote, "The prophets of God should be regarded as physicians whose task is to foster the well-being of the world and its peoples, that through the spirit of oneness, they may heal the sickness of a divided humanity." But the needs of mankind have evolved through the ages, and this is the reason that God has revealed his teachings progressively through a succession of messengers. Referring to the needs of the times we are living in and to the authority of his own revelation, Baha'u'llah writes, "Be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age you live in, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements." Drawing from both the Baha'i writings on education and the framework of anti-bias education, this session will explore the power of education in understanding and addressing biases from the earliest stages of a child's education and centering truthfulness and studying history. It's my pleasure to introduce Sahba Rohani in conversation with fellow educator Cara Hill. Let me give a brief introduction to both of them. Sahba Rohani serves as the executive director of Roots Connected, an initiative she helped found and launch in 2017, born out of a decade of experience and learning from Community Roots Charter School, a pioneer in the diverse by design movement, located in Brooklyn, New York, where coincidentally my parents are from. Since 2016, she's been working to support schools across the country in practices of anti-bias and inclusive education through presentations and conferences, leading multi-day training for school leaders and educators, and coaching schools and organizations directly in institutional shifts towards equity. Sahba holds an MA in International Education, Family, and Community Development from Teachers College, Columbia University. Cara Hill is a high school English teacher in Brooklyn, New York. She has an undergraduate degree in English and African American Studies from Princeton University and a master's degree in English education from New York University. She has worked in both public and independent schools in New York City, as well as with children and youth at Baha'i schools globally. Welcome, Sahba and Cara.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here today. So I really appreciate Baha'i Chat having me here today. Thank you so much. And I'm grateful to just be able to share about the work that I've been engaged in. So much of that work is informed by my fundamental belief and upbringing as a Baha'i. So to be able to share how it's so intricately connected is a real honor. And I've asked my really good friend, Cara, she's one of my dear friends, a fellow educator and a fellow Baha'i, to just be with me here today, to engage in a conversation. You know, I'm such a people person that engaging in a screen with just myself feels almost unbearable. So just having Cara alongside me to have a conversation with, thank you, Cara, for being here.
It is my honor. I thought to start us off, I'd like to ask you to tell us a bit more about you. How did you come to this work? What led you to being where you are right now?
Yeah, you know, I believe that stories are really critical in just understanding human beings, and they're such a fundamental part of anti-bias education. So I myself grew up as a child of immigrants who came to this country from Iran with almost nothing in the early 1970s, and were afraid of going back to their country after the revolution broke out. So like many Persians who came to this country, my incredible parents worked tirelessly to ensure that we acclimated. And like many immigrants, acclimation meant understanding and fitting into white dominant culture. So most of my public school life was in predominantly white, middle upper class classrooms in Arizona. I lived mostly in a duality, to be honest, living one thing at home, trying to be one thing at home, and being something completely different at school. And I learned pretty quickly that school wasn't a place that anyone who didn't fit into the dominant norm really belonged. I remember sitting in history class in 7th grade and wondering why everyone looked the same in the pictures of my textbook. I remember through my elementary school years hearing about Martin Luther King almost exclusively and how he gave a speech. And every year I heard about the speech that he gave, and every year I wondered what else was missing. Being in elementary school at the height of the Iran hostage crisis, I knew that I had to do everything I could to just stay silent and unnoticed. So even questions I had about who we were learning about and who we were not learning about were sort of pushed deep inside me for fear that any speaking up would just further other me. The experiences I had following my elementary and high school years, really the humans that I met, the places that I went to and interacted, the stories I heard, and the things that I learned and pushed myself to learn helped me to put words to the confusion of what I felt while I was growing up. I'd grown up being given a racist education. And I had a lot of undoing to do as I grew older, a lot of relearning. I quickly saw that my skin color and economic privilege, as well as other ways that I hold power, had awarded me a lot of opportunity and a lot of access. And I also came to honor and love the things about myself and my family that had been othered in school. So this idea of personal and collective transformation, this dual process of change, is drawn from the Baha'i teachings of the twofold moral purposes. And it's been really critical for me to consider and it's one that plays a pretty important role and a foundational role in the idea of anti-bias education. I recognize that the need to do my own ongoing work of understanding my own biases, my power, and my positionality, leaning into revolutionary love and committing to ongoing personal transformation, but that alone does not suffice. And in the same way, I have a deep responsibility to contribute to collective transformation. I have a commitment to creating an impact within my own sphere of influence and working collaboratively towards social transformation. And this is really what brought me to the field of education over 20 years ago. And I would say that one of the most informative experiences, as Steve mentioned, was being a founding staff member of Community Roots, this incredible, progressive, and racially and economically integrated K-8 school in Brooklyn, New York, that centers equity and inclusion with an anti-bias approach to education. Both as a teacher there and then as the school's director of community development, my work really entailed learning what it means to build community across lines of difference. The incredible school leaders and teaching staff work tirelessly towards creating an equitable school community. And so Roots Connected was really born out of those practices at Community Roots. And now that school serves as the learning site for this organization. We're a national professional development organization, and we support schools and educators really at our core to focus on ensuring that each child recognizes the humanity in one another. And we believe that anti-bias education can be a tool to make that happen. So I do this hard but rewarding work because I think that every child deserves to be seen in school. I do this work because I cannot be okay with schools being places where kids don't feel like they're honored and they belong. And I do this work because racism and bias eat into the fabric of society. And I believe that anti-bias education and our kids is one place where we can see change.
I've also appreciated over the years of knowing you the ways in which you ground so much of your approach to education, to your connection to the Baha'i faith. And we've had many a conversation about this quotation from Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the faith. Regard man as a mine rich in gems of inestimable value. Education can alone cause it to reveal its treasures and enable mankind to benefit therefrom.
Yeah, you know, I think if I really believe this, if I really this is a quote I grew up with most of my life, and it gets placed into a lot of conversations in Baha'i communities. But if I really believe this, then that means that I see all children as living, breathing, incredible humans that have in them all the creative capacities, all the unique treasures and brilliance. And each one of them is perfect, and each one is deserving of living to their fullest potential. And that means, like, as teachers, we're not owners of all the knowledge, but we have this unique responsibility to mine those gems and to make space to know kids and to give space for kids to tell their stories and be full humans in the classroom. When I look back on my own education, or even the schools that many of my friends' kids are currently in, there's like so little space to do this. They're so bombarded with meetings and meeting standards and raising test scores and completing tasks that true learning is almost lost, right? Like that true mining is lost. And when one considers the heart of racism and bias, in many ways, education has become the way that people are systematically denied that gemmed value. And I would be remiss to talk about education without first talking about it as a system in our society. The Baha'i Writings state that the tensions, divisions, and injustices that currently beset America are symptoms of a long-standing illness. The nation is afflicted with a deep spiritual disorder, manifest in rampant materialism, widespread moral decay, and a deeply ingrained racial prejudice. As a result, millions of our fellow Americans, subject to systemic injustices in many facets of life, are prevented from making their full contributions to society and of partaking fully in its benefits. No one is immune of this disorder. We are all members of this society and to some degree suffer the effects of its maladies. This quote was from the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States, the governing body of the Baha'is in this country. So these systemic injustices don't allow for us to mine those gems. And as the quote states, we're all members of this society, and all of us suffer from that effects to some degree. And if you think you're feeling the short-term benefits of the system, in the long run, there's a greater harm being done. Now, education, we know, is one of the oldest systems in our society. And obviously, I'm not going to go into the history of education, although it is a fascinating one. But it is one of the fundamental ways in which systemic racism is being perpetrated and perpetuated in this country. So to give an example of that, I just wanted to take a look at this image. Cara, I know that you're really familiar with the 4 eyes of oppression. And for those who are listening and watching in today, I'm sure you've seen this or been thinking about how oppression plays out. But I want to specifically look at sort of how that plays out in schools and what that could look like in schools. It feels important to elucidate on how many of these exist within the context of a school. So let's first look at ideological oppression, right? This is the core ideas developed in an oppressive system that justify various isms, that one group is better and therefore has the right to control another. So it's really sort of like the ideas that are baked into the systems that exist. And so it makes me think about what we believe about learning. What does learning actually mean? What are the cultural norms and values that are attached to success? What informs our classroom routines and structures? When we walk into a classroom, why is it easy for us to say, oh, it looks like everyone's focused here. It looks like everyone's learning here. But what does that mean, and how much of that is sort of like baked into the system of what we've been created to think is learning? The other is institutional oppression. It's the way that oppression lives in the system and structures of the school, right? So what are the practices that reinforce power dynamics and ultimately a white dominant culture? Think a lot about like decisions about discipline in schools, right? Like in what ways are we creating punitive discipline plans that ultimately are contributing to the school to prison pipeline? Or are we taking a restorative approach? One where the deed and the doer are separated, one where we're actually centering human beings, right? The decisions about curriculum often fall under this institutionalized oppression, whose stories are heard, whose stories are left out. Interpersonal oppression is how oppression plays out between people. So one example of this is microaggressions, which Maya Angelou talks about as being small murders. They're like the small ways that implicit bias and racist thinking is sort of like expressed in a very commonplace way. And that also, the interpersonal also plays out in like, you know, I'm thinking about like grade team meetings or in conversations with school leaders, like whose voices are heard, whose ideas and perspectives and contributions are given value, right? And then internalized oppression is what happens when marginalized and oppressed groups of people are told something so often, it is so baked into the ideological belief that they begin to believe it. Not because it's true, but because those in power perpetuate it. So this makes you consider like, what are the messages that our kids are getting about themselves, about their own identity? This happens so often. And when we're not examining that, it's so detrimental to our kids really being their full and true selves when they're constantly told different messages about themselves. And they don't know how to evaluate success because we're told that it only looks a certain way.
You know, a lot of the practice as an educator is thinking about the ways in which we've been educated. And as I think about these 4 I's, I think about what it was to grow up mixed race and Black in predominantly white institutions. So in my schooling, I was often the only person of African descent in kind of any space. And in particular, I remember a book that was really a challenge for me to study was Jane Austen, Mansfield Park. And, you know, this is a book written, you know, kind of early 1800s, set in around that time in England. And the family owns slaves. And what propels the plot at one point is the head of the household has to go to the Caribbean to, you know, check in on what's going on his plantation. And it wasn't until years later where I had that aha moment of what was keeping me from engaging fully with this text was that it was, you know, not only could I not see myself in the text, the kind of elephant in the room for me was the fact that it would be, you know, some of my ancestors who were enslaved humans, not slaves, enslaved and stolen labor, that allows this narrative to even exist. And there was never any talk of that. And so what gets internalized is the ways in which you're seen or not seen in a text. So that quote unquote lack of engagement was in fact because I was really having this challenge and problem that I couldn't articulate at the time and kind of think about in terms of how my school content was being presented to me. And that's a really small one that I can think of many. And now as a teacher, see so many times, time and again, the ways in which biases play out and have real implications for students within educational systems.
Yeah, Cara, and so much of what you just talked about, and thank you for sharing from your own experience, so much of what you talked about is so connected to what anti-bias education is. And I want to sort of like start to dig into that, but to understand anti-bias education, it's important to first understand what bias is. And I know that these are not terms that are new to anyone, but just for the sake of a shared language moving forward, I wanted to share these two definitions. So explicit bias is sort of the attitudes and beliefs, whether they're positive or negative, that we very consciously or deliberately hold and express about a group or a person. And then implicit bias are the attitudes and beliefs, again, whether they're positive or negative, about other people, ideas, or institutions that are actually occurring outside of our conscious awareness and control, which affects our opinions and behavior. And everyone has implicit biases. They develop over time. And people can work hard to combat and change those. Of course, how we experience explicit and implicit bias isn't the same. It's not a universal experience for everyone. It depends so much on our different identifiers, and also how those identifiers impact the way we're moving through the world and experiencing bias. I think maybe this other chart might be helpful in just an easier way to sort of understand the two.
What I appreciate about this chart, one is because I'm a visual learner, is the way I can kind of parallel explicit, implicit bias. And again, this idea of, especially of like when one's aware of a bias and acting on it versus being unaware. And the examples stand out to me. So, and they seem extreme, but when you apply them, they really resonate for me. So, example, I will only get on a plane if there's a male pilot. Explicit bias. Implicitly, female pilot is not as skilled, trustworthy as a male pilot. You know, I think about the data that surrounds STEM education. So like stats around girls, young women in, you know, especially science and math classes. Like if you look, especially like Northeast United States data is with which I'm most familiar, those numbers go down over time. Mm-hmm. And a lot of, you know, thinking is going on in education circles of like, when does that explicit, implicit bias start that over time, those identified females like get discouraged from pursuing science and math. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a really tangible example of how explicit and implicit bias can work in schools.
Yeah, and I think what you just shared just for me so explicitly plays out in this graphic that's really helpful for me. The Anti-Defamation League has created this to show sort of how hate grows. And I know there's a lot of words on this graphic, so I just want to pause for a minute and just give folks some time to look at it, to be able to read it. Just think about maybe what you notice, what's resonating with you, what you might have questions about connected to this. I think that in so many ways, anti-bias education addresses the different parts of this pyramid. So as educators, or really anyone who works with kids or is around kids, if we're working to address the things in the bottom sections of this pyramid, then we're making it harder for the rest of the pyramid to have something to stand on. And this is really what anti-bias education has the power to do. And this is something that can start regardless of the age of children, from very young. So anti-bias education, rather than being a formula for a particular curriculum, it's sort of an underpinning perspective and framework that permeates everything, including your interactions with children, families, and colleagues. And I'm grateful for this idea of having these three stakeholders in a school community be part of the framework of anti-bias education, because all of these folks, children, families, and colleagues make up that school space, right? And that anti-bias education takes an active problem-solving approach that's integrated into all aspects of existing curriculum in a school's environment. It promotes this understanding of social problems, but provides kids with strategies for improving social conditions. So I think it's really important to remember that anti-bias education is not necessarily like a set curriculum, a set of lessons that you're doing, but it's really like a framework and an approach by which to think about education, right? And it moves beyond this idea where it's like, it's now 2:30, we can talk about racism, or it's this month and we can focus on this, period of history. But it's really embedded in the lens with which we're looking at education across the board. And really at the center of anti-bias education, and what I want to do in the next few slides is sort of like talk folks through the framework of anti-bias education and what it looks like. And what I'm hopeful that folks will be able to take away from this is the idea of the implications for this across grade, from pre-K up to 12th grade. There are such implications for this approach, right? And at the center of anti-bias education is identity and inclusion. That allows for children to be their whole selves and to see themselves as part of a community. That means that classrooms have to be places where kids are asked to share their stories of their culture and their family identity. And like we talked about earlier, unfortunately, there isn't always a lot of time, or it's not prioritized to make sure that this is actually happening. We want to make sure that kids have their voices and perspectives heard, right? And that when we're really sort of centering their identity before they even dive into learning new content. So oftentimes, having something like a shorter identity unit, or some ways for kids to be thinking about their own identities and perspectives before they start learning something, becomes really helpful, right? So myself, like, I identify as a Persian American. I grew up as a Baha'i. I'm cisgender. I identify as a woman. There's so many ways in which that, like, my filters totally impact the way that I'm learning history. They totally impact what I read and how I think. And it's really critical for kids to sort of like center that and to think about that before they dive into doing that thinking. I think also kids have to see themselves as part of a community. And that sort of pushes back against this it's a counter narrative to this like white supremacist ideal of individualism that's often seeped into our culture. But imagining school spaces, and this happens a lot in the younger, I feel like in the younger grades, kids, especially, like I was a kindergarten teacher for a number of years, but we sort of teach kids that they're part of a community and they have to work with others, etc. But I think it's really this idea that like my decisions, what I do, impacts other people. And that idea shouldn't stop at the younger ages, but it should actually continue to develop as they move on. Cara, I know you work with older kids. Do you see space for this to really have impact in your practice?
Absolutely. I think in particular, this idea of this interdependence and connectedness, by building classroom communities and sort of unpacking some of identity as you go forward and build a learning community, it starts to build a trust and truth between students. Yeah. But I think even more specifically, it's also this idea of the collective is so tricky in systems where so much is competition based, be it grades. In New York City, a lot of the system, as you go from middle school to high school, you're testing into schools. So all of a sudden you're in competition with your classmates, the same when you're applying out to university. And it's really tricky to kind of combat and unpack the way the systems create that individualism that you talked about. And the gems become test scores and grades versus that multifaceted gem of unfolding authentic and rich learning that's also combating biases.
Yeah, I think what you just hit on is also so critical when you think about the different, another important part of kids' identities is also ability, which is often left out of the conversation. And that has to do with learning styles as well, right? That children learn in really different ways, not just children, human beings, we learn in different ways. And depending on the circumstance, I might want to read something versus watch something versus have a conversation with someone. And that learning is really not a static thing. It's really dynamic, right? So as one part of inclusion, this idea of inclusion within the framework of anti-bias education is leaning on this idea that there's no average learner, right? that there's variability in learning. And so it's sort of our responsibility to create access to curriculum. And that's such a critical part of creating equitable classroom communities. So instead of sort of having this perfect curriculum, right? And having it only be taught in one way or for only certain kids to be able to access is a disservice to the ways that kids learn. So really that mindset shifting around like what is the average learner, you know, even these ideas of like a gifted and talented, and like what does that mean about like what we think about kids and what we think about you know, what learning is. It makes me think about that ideological approach and the 4 I's around learning. So I think it's just important to like center identity and inclusion as part of the framework, right? This is the conceptual framework of anti-bias education, and Roots Connect has adapted that from Derman, Sparks, Edwards, and Goins. And it shows sort of like, this graphic I think shows the different pieces of the framework. And what I want to do is sort of dig into some of the other aspects of the framework with folks today.
One of the kind of pivotal quotations from the Baha'i faith about justice, and one that we've had a lot of conversation about, is also from Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder. O son of spirit, the best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. Turn not away therefrom if thou desirest me, and neglect it not that I may confide in thee. By its aid thou shalt see with thine own eyes, and not through the eyes of others, and shalt know of thine own knowledge, and not through the knowledge of thy neighbor. Ponder this in thy heart, how it behooveth thee to be. Verily, justice is my gift to thee, and the sign of my loving kindness. Set it then before thine eyes.
Cara and I have had so many conversations about this quote that I even hearing you read it, it's like resonates. Different parts of conversations we've had to resonate with me. I think fundamentally, if I really believe that justice is a faculty of the soul, and that each child actually has the capacity to see or recognize what is fair or unfair, or what is just and unjust, then schools and classrooms need to be places where kids are taught to think critically. I think a lot about my nephew who's 4 years old, where, you know, every other, you know, statement out of his mouth is like, that's not fair, but that's not fair. That's just not fair, right? And the fact that like they can recognize that at that young means that like that is a faculty of their souls, right? And that we have the capacity to be able to bring that out in them. So kids start from a very young age being extremely aware of what's fair and not fair. And then there's this power to us creating space for them to be able to have those conversations. That means being really explicit about, for example, like having kids look for bias, omission, and stereotype in texts that they're reading. And sometimes that feels like, oh, my kid doesn't notice these things, or that feels like they don't know this stuff yet. But I mean, we're working like with 4 and 5-year-olds in kindergarten who, like, when you actually talk about what a stereotype is, they're able to really pick up on that, and they're really able to understand it. And then using units that, you know, we have this incredible 2nd grade team at Community Roots that uses the fairy tale unit like as a genre for an entry point to have kids think critically about whose voices are missing. And the kids come up with these brilliant things. Like, they're like, why it's not fair that, you know, the women always, like the girls always have to be, you know, saved by the men, or that they always have to be quote unquote beautiful, or that all of the folks have this, all of the characters have the same skin shades, right? They really like think so deeply about that because there's space to talk about it. You do a fairy tale unit too, right, Cara, in the older grades, which is so interesting. It's like, that's a 2nd grade conversation, right? But you're having these conversations with your high schoolers.
Yeah, so in one of my high school classes, we look at fairy tales, specifically starting with the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. So they're dramatic fairy tales from like 1800s, but now have become so prolific and popular. And one of the things we think about is, you know, who created the source, right? So what the author wants you to think, who is marginalized, kind of going through those questions. But also then thinking about this idea of what coming of age tales do, and what the messages are, and we think adaptively. So how could they be adapted for the 21st century, these same Grimm's fairy tales? So, you know, and over the years, the stories have been so rich that kids have used, and then they often share them with younger students in our school community. So Little Red Riding Hood became Little Red Hoodie in the aftermath of the killing of Trayvon Martin, in which the protagonist is a young Black boy who puts up his hood with tragic consequences. And in this story, the student made the wolf the police. Obviously, that resonates in our current times so richly as well. Adaptations of Cinderella. Cinderella not only rejects the prince and goes to law school, sometimes she decides she wants a princess instead. So the ways in which kids can write in themselves and see themselves is kind of key to that critical thinking. That said, turning back to identity and inclusion, I also, in my kind of, you know, expansion of the class and thinking about what are those other coming of age narratives that don't get seen. So in particular, like First Nations coming of age tales, others like, so trying to expand that thinking to what's not just quote unquote canonical, established, but what are these other ways that cultures and peoples have also given the same instruction to young people coming of age?
Yeah, and I think that space, like having kids be able to even think about that, it allows them to sort of ask questions about perspective and power in these like really rich ways that are obviously developmentally appropriate when you think about it, right? And that's really important to think about. And then they're also then at that point able to listen to perspectives other than their own. So it's not only about, I have this perspective and I get to share it, but I also get to hear that other people have perspectives that are different than mine. And again, that connects back to this idea of inclusion, right? This idea that like we're interconnected. And so your perspective matters in the grand scheme of things. It helps me to understand how we're connected to each other and how our thinking might be connected. And then I want to be really clear as we're sort of like walking through these. It was quite hard to take like an entire, you know, framework and thinking and put it into like 30 minutes, right? So I want to be really clear as we're even sharing these, there's so much incredible depth and examples and what this looks like in practice that we just don't have the time to dive into in the same way that we would want. But I do think that it's important that the framework can be applied to so many different spaces depending on the circumstance and depending on the developmental like sort of approach of kids, right? So this other element that's so critical to anti-bias education is tied to Baha'u'llah's writings on truthfulness. Baha'u'llah says that truthfulness is the foundation of all human virtues. And he says that we should discern with the eye of oneness his glorious handiwork and look at all things with a searching eye. I think a lot about this idea of truth, right? And I think about how the Baha'i perspective on consultation, for example, talks about a clash of opinions in order to search for truth. And that can only happen when we have diversity and representation, right? Brian Stevenson, who's one of my, he's one of my sort of like go-to inspirational humans in this work of equity in this country right now. And he talks about how truth-telling opens the way for justice. And I think about the power that has in actual classrooms, right? So if our kids are actually being taught to search for truth, that means then history, for example, is learned from multiple perspectives. And we're pushing back against this idea that Adichie, who's an incredible writer, talks about with the danger of a single story. That we're not looking at groups of people even as monoliths, right? But that we're really able to think about the depth and nuances of stories of groups of people. So for example, in school, if there's, if you're learning about migrant workers, what was the experience like for workers? Does it matter or depend where they're coming from, in what countries, what their circumstance was before? What's the experience for women? What's the experience for men? What's the experience for young children, right? That depth is really what allows us to search for truth. So often we're in spaces where, or so often curriculum is sort of done in this sort of tourist curriculum approach, where we're sort of like hitting a lot of things really fast. And I would push us to maybe consider, like, instead of, you know, covering so much, maybe why don't we like dig deep into one piece of history, into one, you know, one current event, so much deeper, so that we can really learn about and think about the perspectives that exist.
Can I also add that it reminds me that this knowledge isn't static, it's ever evolving. And if we think about this search for truth, it's, you know, kind of constantly unfolding as hopefully we're moving towards greater empowerment and thinking, and narratives emerge. And I'll give a brief example. You know, if we look at the data around the transatlantic slave trade, that a lot of that data comes from like the cargo, you know, statistics of slave ships. So it's white, you know, ship captains, and then, you know, merchants who are kind of ruthlessly quantifying data about enslaved humans. And I think, you know, the reason I mention that is that that data is going to keep changing as history evolves, as more stories emerge, as more facts emerge over time. Like, it's never a static point. And so that kind of notion of constant inquiry, even at a young age. And I want to be careful. It's not so much that we're saying anti-bias education is that you just trust all systems and you challenge teachers and so on. It's more just that idea that it's not a static, this term, this quote unquote mastery of knowledge, which is already a problematic phrase. It's that it's actually an ever evolving process, and it is for us adults as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like the power of that is that it allows kids to build understanding and connection, just like we were talking about earlier. And I think like it's also important to think about the representation in schools. Like, who are kids seeing? Do they see kids that look like, do they see adults that look like them, or who mirror experiences that are close to their experiences, right? In education, we think a lot about this idea of windows and mirrors. So making space for kids to see themselves and making space for kids to see others as well. And that's become so critical when thinking about anti-bias education. So this last piece of anti-bias education becomes extremely critical as children's awareness about injustice increases, right? So the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States says the oneness of humanity is far more than a slogan or an abstract and unattainable ideal. Awareness of the spiritual reality of human beings carries with it the moral requirement that all be given every opportunity to fulfill their potential and to contribute to the advancement of civilization. So I love that, right? It's like it is the moral requirement that every single one of us fulfill our potential, right? So that means like that's where the idea of like the gems come in. And that we have the potential to then contribute, not just potential, but sort of like the duty, the opportunity to contribute to the advancement of civilization, right? And so this idea of social action becomes really critical for kids. So in schools and in classrooms, or any work done with kids, this is such a big part of the community building process for Baha'is as well, right? Through the lens of children's classes and junior youth groups. This idea of centering social action becomes so important. So in these images on the right, you're gonna see, these were sort of pulled from some of the incredible teaching work that was happening at Community Roots in the kindergarten classes, when they were asked to think about who's represented in the shows and the movies that they watch. And the kids the teachers took them through a process of taking inventory of it, and they realized that a lot of people are excluded from their movies and shows. And then they held interviews with members of the school community, asking them to describe if they saw themselves in shows and movies growing up. And I'm telling you, there's nothing like 26 tiny little faces staring up at you and listening to you share about how you never saw your experience in shows and movies growing up, right? And it's definitely better than any therapy session you have to pay for when you just have a 5-year-old raise their thumb and just say, I'm so sorry that you felt like that. And then what they do is take action. They write letters to Nickelodeon. They ask them to have more representation in their shows and movies. Now, of course, this like one example sits in a much larger unit of studying families and doing identity work with these kindergartners. But you can see from this one example that children are sort of seeing themselves responsible for working towards justice through social action, and that they recognize what it means to work towards change with a focus of working like with a power with a group rather than a power over a group, right? Which is so, again, such a counter narrative to the way a lot of even development work happens across the country and across the world, right? And then that kids are asked to assume a posture of learning, like even having kids have someone come in to be interviewed, like, what did that feel like? What was that sound like, right? Not seeing themselves as experts. And then recognizing that action can take many different forms. So sometimes it means elevating a conversation, and sometimes it means like mobilizing and community organizing for action, right? And so that both of those things can coexist, and both of those things have so much value. And from my understanding of the approach of social action through the lens of the Baha'i community, it's so similar, right? And that this has, like, we have the power to start this with kids at so young of an age. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, as I'm taking all of this in, I'm also thinking about the ways in which you talked earlier about the personal and the collective, that, you know, the personal is the teacher in the classroom, the adult facilitating the children or youth activity, is that it's not about my beliefs or ideals. It's about what comes from
Right.
these gems, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think that's key to that personal collective also for those educators on the call, or even those who might be working with children and youth, perhaps through Baha'i classes in their communities, is that really that pause of individual inventory within the faith. We're asked to take ourselves into account each day. And I think that also relates to biases and the ways in which I'm kind of always kind of working and thinking about that evolving understanding or understandings. I allow those understandings to evolve and nurture them evolving in diverse ways in my classroom, in my family, in my other learning communities. I think as we draw to a close, it's just really, you know, the urgency of this work, I think, is so important to kind of name, recognize. And it's been urgent for, you know, many, many years. So, but these two quotations also from our National Spiritual Assembly, our national elected governing body, I think are key to look at as we come to a close.
Yeah, it says that the critical nature of this moment and the necessity of bold action to address the historic opportunities it presents means that we must accelerate our efforts to remove the stains of prejudice and injustice from the fabric of our society. These are, again, excerpts pulled from an incredible letter on February 25th, 2017 from the National Spiritual Assembly. And, you know, I mentioned this earlier, and Cara, you sort of alluded to this right now, that, I mean, again, what we're sort of like talking about, that we've like sort of digested into this teeny tiny amount of time, in no way does justice to the work and depth of anti-bias education, but it does give a window into what power that type of education has for our kids. We're in such a pivotal moment in the history of our country, and we just have no time to lose.
Yeah.
Our kids are our most precious resources. They deserve to be in spaces where their full selves can exist consistently and intentionally. And they all deserve to be in equitable and just classroom communities.
Oh, Sahba, thank you so, so much. You've given us so much to think about. There have been lots of questions coming in, and I know we won't be able to get to all of them, but we hope that this conversation continues amongst you and is obviously an ongoing dialogue. But if you're willing, I'd love to take a few of the questions.
Yeah, sure.
First of all, who are you wearing? No, sorry, that's my question because you look amazing.
Great question.
Let's start with one. And again, I apologize that we won't be able to get to all of these really rich questions. But, I think one that, regardless of who's on the call, we all have various connections to children and youth. What are some practical ways that we can help our children and others become more aware of and able to express their identity? That's a broad question, but I think you could choose any, multiple ways in which you give an example.
Yeah, so I think that idea, the reason why I chose to really spend some time talking about personal and collective action is that I believe really strongly in this parallel process that if we as adults want to do this work with our kids, we have to be in that ongoing process of doing that work ourselves in order to become more comfortable even in the conversations that we're having and just aware of our own biases in those conversations. I think one, oh gosh, that's such a large question. There's a few things. I mean, that's what that question in essence, I mean, my biggest answer to that, if I could give an answer that's this big without, that's what my organization does. What we do is support parents and support educators with doing this type of work. So in the very practical way, it's supporting parents in this idea of where do I start? Where do I interrupt conversations? How do I continue to have conversations? What does that look like? In the schools, that means that's the same type of work. How am I prioritizing building community with my kids? How am I prioritizing setting really clear norms and having conversations about current events in a way that's responsible and allows for multiple perspectives? I think a really tangible way is just the access that we're giving to kids about to human beings that are different than we are, right? To perspectives that are different than we are. That can be done through obviously books, and there's been tons of book lists that have been circulated, but that doesn't really take the place of actual human connection, actual friendships that are developed, and actual ways that we learn about people in different ways. And then I think it's prioritizing having space to have the conversations instead of running away from conversations, which I think we've as adults often get sort of conditioned, and this sounds like a gross generalization, but in circles I've been in, it's harder for adults actually to engage in these conversations than it is for kids. Mm-hmm. And kids just need a space. They just need the entry point. They just need even the question of what do you think about that? That feels really unfair. Tell me what you think about that. It's a very tangible way to be able to engage in a conversation.
I think another part of the answer that comes to mind, both as a teacher and a parent, is kind of my self-educating and thinking about the ways in which these systems have been put in place. In my school right now, there's a collective read of Stamped from the Beginning, which is by Ibram X. Kendi. And there's also a version written for adolescents.
Yeah.
My 17-year-old has to read this whole one. But, I think there's so much within the book. But one thing that the book starts with is the way in which he unpacks so much of how, quote unquote, higher education has been established and really racist underpinnings. That was an aha moment for me, even as someone who studied within this field, that, it's again, that knowledge is kind of constantly evolving. So for adults, the ways in which we're kind of questioning and self-educating. And I think also there are times in which I do it respectfully, and I do it in a spirit of creating unity, not disruption, where I'm asking questions about my son's curriculum and its implications. And I think that is, kind of key. So we gave a very long answer to that, but we only really have time for one more question. So Here's a specific one. If we answer it quickly, maybe we can sneak in another. This is a really kind of practical, like, can you clarify what it means that, quote, children see themselves in the adults at the school, end quote. Like, could you talk about a little bit more about what that looks like?
That specifically is referring to just representation and teaching staff. So making sure that you have, like, the teaching staff does not, like, don't all identify in the same way. And the more that you have that diversity of representation, the more that children have are able to see themselves and connect with people who might look more like them. So I think it's really about just how we're, who are the adults in the space, right? And again, this is tied to a much larger conversation around just representation in the teaching field and in education. And there's a long history that's tied to that as well. Yeah. And so I think I'm referring specifically to, like, you know, kids seeing themselves, their identities represented in the adults that are in the school space.
No, I know some of the other questions that have come up that we don't have time for today are about Roots Connected itself, which also has a dynamic web presence and lots of ways that you offer programming for, you know, families, not just educators. So that also is a way in which you can learn more and keep the conversation going. But
yeah, please be connected with us. Rootsconnected.org is our website. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, apparently. But find us, you know, like that, the programming that we have created has been so based off of the questions that we've learned and heard from teachers and parents over the last few years. We predominantly focus on, like, real, like, professional development for educators, but since this, like, homeschool wall has sort of disappeared and we've been in this, like, really in a new type of space, and since there's been sort of this, like, this, like, stirring of consciousness, as the House of Justice talks about, in terms of, like, where we're at in this country, Roots Connected has decided to offer also a number of workshops for families as well, just because, again, that critical role. So please find us, please connect with us. I'm happy to have conversations with folks outside of this. Again, like, I know the nature of this doesn't really allow for, like, a dialogue, which is how I prefer to communicate with folks. And again, this is just such much deeper work than what we can cover in this amount of time, but I hope that it's in some way helpful. Oh, the question about practical, the questions that are coming up about how to do this practically, if you go to the Roots Connected Instagram, and that connects to the Community Roots Instagram, the Community Roots is the learning site for Roots Connected. A lot of those practical examples are shared there as well, and that might be helpful to give context to what these goals look like in practice. Hi, Steve, I see you're back.
Oh, I figured I had to come back. I actually wanted to keep listening to the two of you. I was perfectly happy just to sit and listen. First of all, I just want to say thank you for the work you do every day. Cara and Sahba, this has been so enjoyable. I have two 17-year-old kids, so I've witnessed the failures sometimes of the educational system. I think what you're doing is so incredibly important. You can see, and I love the fact that you were effortlessly weaving your comments in with the writings. And you can see that you're doing that with your life as well. So kudos to you for not just reading the writings, but living them as well, and adding so much value to society. And I agree with you so much that it's so critical that we teach our children these things. And we're seeing the results of not doing so in today's society. So thank you both for such an entertaining and helpful presentation for me. I'll just say, as a fan, as much as a moderator, thank you so much. I look forward to hearing more about what you do and how you do it. And I know you're going to do very well because there's such a great need for what you're doing. So thank you again. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you to Baha'i Chat for allowing us the opportunity. Truly, it was really an honor to be able to, in such a clear way, be able to connect this framework to the writing. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cara.
Thank you.
So in closing, I'll just say we hope that people listen to this. We hope that people add this to their world, and we need, this is a critical time, as she said, for humanity. We need to add these teachings to our classrooms. We need to be at an early age teaching children anti-bias. People are asking, how do we fix racism? Sahba just told us today. Thank you, Cara. Thank you, Sahba. Thank you for everything you do. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye.